brimming with rebellion, unshakable faith and miraculous victories. A story so gripping. What if I told you there's a book brimming with rebellion, unshakable faith and miraculous victories? A story so gripping, so powerful, that you'll wonder why it has been hidden from you. This is First Maccabees, a book banned from the Western Bible, but preserved in sacred canons like the Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Bible, where its message continues to inspire generations. This is the story of a people's fight for survival, a tale of heroes who stood against overwhelming odds to preserve their faith, identity, and freedom. But why have so many of us never encountered this book? The answer lies in the complex history of biblical canonization. During the Protestant Reformation, leaders like Martin Luther sought to align the Bible with the Hebrew Scriptures, relegating First Maccabees and other deuterocanonical books to the margins. In contrast, the Catholic and Eastern Orthodox churches retained these texts, recognizing their spiritual and historical value. The Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Bible goes even further, embracing First Maccabees as an integral part of God's Word, woven into the rich tapestry of salvation history. So, why does this matter? Because First Maccabees is more than just a historical account. It's a story of defiance against tyranny, of miracles in the face of despair, and of God's providence guiding his people through darkness. It is a vivid portrayal of the Jewish struggle against Greek oppression during the intertestamental period, a time when silence seemed to stretch between the Old and New Testaments. The story begins with Alexander the Great, whose conquests spread Hellenistic culture across the known world. After his death, his empire fractured, and Judea fell under the control of the Seleucid Empire, led by Antiochus Epiphanes, a ruler whose cruelty and arrogance knew no bounds. Antiochus sought to erase Jewish identity by outlawing their worship, desecrating the temple in Jerusalem, and forcing the people to adopt pagan practices. Amid this oppression, a spark ignited, a resistance led by Mattathias, a priest in the town of Modian. With his sons, including the legendary Judas Maccabeus, Mattathias sparked a rebellion that would grow into a full-scale war for freedom. The Maccabees, as they became known, fought not just for their land, but for their God, their covenant, and their right to live as his people. Why does this story remain so compelling? Because it speaks to the universal human struggle for faith and freedom. It reminds us that even in the darkest times, courage and devotion can light a path to victory. The themes of First Maccabees, standing firm in the face of persecution, trusting in God's providence, and fighting for what is right, resonate as deeply today as they did more than 2 millennia ago. This is Deep Bible Stories, where we uncover the hidden gems of Scripture, including the banned books that hold profound truths and lessons for our lives. If you've ever wondered about the stories that didn't make it into the Western Bible, this video is for you. Let's explore the courage, faith, and struggles of the Maccabees, heroes who remind us that no power on earth can extinguish the light of God's people. So, are you ready to uncover a story of rebellion, miracles, and unyielding faith? Let's dive into the untold story of First Maccabees. Trust us, you won't want to miss this. From the powerful introduction of First Maccabees as a story of rebellion, faith, and miracles, we now turn to the world in which it unfolds, a world poised on the edge of chaos and transformation. This is the backdrop of the Maccabean revolt, where the shadows of Hellenistic culture clashed with the enduring light of Jewish faith. To understand the courage and conviction of the Maccabees, we must first understand the oppressive forces they faced. It began with Alexander the Great. Rising to power in the 4th century BCE, Alexander was more than a conqueror. He was a visionary who sought to unify the known world under the banner of Hellenistic culture. With each victory, he spread Greek language, art, philosophy, and religion across the lands he subdued. When Alexander died unexpectedly in 323 BCE, his vast empire splintered into smaller kingdoms, each ruled by one of his generals. Among these were the Ptolemaic kingdom in Egypt and the Seleucid Empire in Syria, which would come to dominate Judea. At first, Judea's position between these two rival powers brought relative stability. The Jewish people were able to practice their faith and maintain their identity, even as Greek influence crept into their daily lives. Hellenistic ideas infiltrated education, governance, and even the priesthood, creating tension between those who embraced Greek culture and those who clung to the Torah. But everything changed with the rise of Antiochus IV Epiphanes, a Seleucid ruler whose arrogance was matched only by his cruelty. Antiochus styled himself as Epiphanes, meaning God manifest, and his reign marked one of the darkest chapters in Jewish history. Antiochus IV's ambition knew no bounds. Desiring to unify his empire through cultural assimilation, he targeted the Jewish people with brutal measures aimed at erasing their identity. He outlawed key aspects of Jewish worship, including circumcision, Sabbath observance, and the study of the Torah. Copies of the sacred texts were seized and burned, and anyone found in possession of them faced death. But Antiochus didn't stop at suppressing Jewish practices. He went further, desecrating the very heart of Jewish faith, the temple in Jerusalem. In an act of unspeakable sacrilege, he set up an altar to Zeus inside the temple and sacrificed pigs on it, defiling the sanctuary and mocking the God of Israel. This period, often referred to as the Abomination of Desolation, left the Jewish people in a state of despair. For devout Jews, the temple was more than a building. It was the dwelling place of God, the center of their spiritual and communal life. To see it defiled was a blow not just to their faith, but to their very identity as God's covenant people. The Hellenistic imposition wasn't limited to religious practices, it extended to every aspect of life. Greek gods and philosophies were promoted, and Jewish traditions were mocked as backward and irrelevant. The cultural pressure was immense, creating divisions within the Jewish community itself. Some, known as Hellenists, embraced Greek customs and sought to assimilate, seeing it as a path to prosperity and acceptance. Others, the Hasidim, the pious ones, resisted, determined to remain faithful to God's law no matter the cost. Antiochus' decrees turned the land of Judea into a tinderbox. Communities were torn apart as neighbors turned on one another, reporting those who continued to practice Judaism in secret. Public executions became spectacles of terror, designed to crush the spirit of resistance. One cannot help but wonder, how did the Jewish people endure such darkness? But as history shows, oppression often ignites the flame of rebellion. While Antiochus wielded his power with cruelty, he underestimated the resilience of those whose faith was rooted in the covenant. The seeds of revolt were sown in the hearts of those who refused to bow to idols or abandon their God. This is the world in which First Maccabees begins, a world where faith was outlawed, where the temple lay desecrated, and where the very identity of God's people was under attack. It was a time of fear, but also of hope. A hope that would soon be embodied by a priest named Mattathias and his sons, whose defiance would spark a movement that changed history. Imagine living in this world. The traditions you hold dear, the prayers that sustain you, and the laws that guide your life have all been declared illegal. The very temple where you've encountered God is now a shrine to a foreign deity. Soldiers roam the streets watching for any sign of rebellion, while collaborators among your own people betray those who resist. What would you do? Would you compromise to protect your family? Or would you risk everything to remain faithful to God? This is the question that confronted the people of Judea, and their answer would shape the story of First Maccabees. This moment in history challenges us to reflect on our own faith. What would we do if our beliefs were outlawed, if living out our faith came with the threat of persecution or death? The Jewish people of this time remind us that faith is not just a private matter. It is a declaration of allegiance to a God who is greater than any earthly power. The world of First Maccabees is distant in time, but close in spirit. The tension between cultural conformity and spiritual fidelity is one we still face today. As we journey through this story, let it inspire us to stand firm in our own faith, no matter the cost. Now, as the stage is set for rebellion, we turn to the spark that ignited the fire, the defiance of Mattathias and the rise of the Maccabees. As the shadows of Greek oppression deepened over Judea, the stage was set for an act of defiance that would ignite a revolution. Out of the despair of desecration and persecution, one man rose, a priest whose courage would spark a movement that changed the course of history. This is the story of Mattathias, a man whose refusal to compromise became the rallying cry of the faithful. In the small town of Modian, Mattathias lived as a respected priest and leader among his people. He was a descendant of Aaron, the brother of Moses, and his life was dedicated to upholding the laws and traditions of the covenant. But even in Modian, far from the grandeur of Jerusalem, the oppressive hand of Antiochus IV Epiphanes reached. One fateful day, emissaries of the king arrived in Modian, bringing with them orders that would test the hearts of every Jew. A pagan altar was set up in the town square, and the king's officer called the people to gather. In a voice heavy with arrogance, he declared that sacrifices to the Greek gods must be made, a public act of allegiance to Antiochus's authority and a blatant rejection of the God of Israel. The officer's gaze swept over the crowd, and his words were calculated to instill both fear and shame. "Mattathias," he said, his voice ringing out, "you are a leader, honored and respected by your people. Be the first to comply, and your house will be richly rewarded. Show your loyalty to the king, and others will follow your example." The crowd held its breath, all eyes on Mattathias. The weight of the moment pressed heavily upon him. To obey the king's command would mean betraying everything he believed, but to resist would bring swift and brutal consequences. Mattathias stepped forward, his voice firm and resolute. "Even if all the nations under the king's dominion obey him," he declared, "I, my sons and my brothers, will walk in the covenant of our fathers. We will not forsake the law and ordinances. We will not obey the king's commands or turn aside from our faith to the right hand or to the left." But before the king's officer could respond, a shocking act of betrayal unfolded. A Jewish man, fearing the wrath of the Seleucids, stepped forward to offer a sacrifice on the pagan altar. The crowd gasped as he reached for the knife, ready to perform the forbidden act. Righteous anger burned within Mattathias. He could not stand by and watch the covenant of God trampled underfoot. With a sudden surge of strength, he lunged forward, striking down the Jewish man who had chosen to comply. Then, with the same unwavering conviction, he turned and killed the king's officer, silencing the voice of oppression. The crowd erupted in chaos. Fear mingled with awe at what they had just witnessed. Mattathias, his voice cutting through the commotion, cried out, "Let everyone who is zealous for the law and supports the covenant come with me." With those words, the spark of rebellion was lit. Mattathias and his sons fled to the wilderness, leaving behind their home and possessions, but carrying with them the flame of resistance. Others, inspired by his courage, joined them. Farmers, shepherds, and faithful priests, men and women who had suffered under the yoke of Greek oppression, gathered in the hills, their hearts united by a common cause, to defend the covenant and reclaim their freedom. Life in the wilderness was harsh. The rebels were hunted by the Seleucid forces who sought to crush the uprising before it could gain momentum. But Mattathias and his followers refused to surrender. They launched guerrilla attacks, striking quickly and disappearing into the rugged terrain. Their knowledge of the land and their unwavering faith gave them an edge against the better-equipped enemy. Mattathias's leadership was not just tactical. It was spiritual. He reminded his followers of the God who had delivered their ancestors from Egypt, who had parted the Red Sea and brought down the walls of Jericho. "Be strong and courageous," he told them, echoing the words of Joshua. "Do not fear them, for the battle belongs to the Lord." As the movement grew, the price of resistance became painfully clear. Mattathias and his followers faced not only the wrath of the Seleucids, but also the heartbreaking cost of fighting for their faith. Families were torn apart, lives were lost, and the specter of martyrdom loomed over them all. Mattathias himself grew older, his strength waning, but his resolve unshaken. Before his death, he gathered his sons and gave them his final charge. To Judas, his third son, he entrusted the leadership of the rebellion, knowing that his courage and skill would carry the fight forward. "Be zealous for the law," Mattathias said, "and give your lives for the covenant of our fathers. Remember the deeds of your ancestors, and let them inspire you to greatness." With those words, Mattathias passed the mantle of leadership to Judas Maccabeus, whose name would become synonymous with the rebellion. But the legacy of Mattathias lived on, not only in the victories won by his sons, but in the faith and courage that ignited a nation. Imagine being in the crowd that day in Modian, watching as Mattathias stepped forward to defy the king's orders. You see the tension in his face, the fire in his eyes, and then the moment of decision, the strike that changes everything. Fear and hope battle within you, and as his rallying cry rings out, you realize that the choice before him is now before you. Would you follow him into the wilderness, leaving behind the safety of conformity for the uncertain path of faith and resistance? Mattathias' defiance challenges us to consider our own convictions. What are we willing to sacrifice to remain faithful to God? How do we respond when our beliefs are challenged or when the pressure to conform feels overwhelming? His story reminds us that standing for what is right often comes with a cost, but it also brings the possibility of transformation, of lighting a fire that cannot be extinguished. As we move from Mattathias's defiance to the rise of Judas Maccabeus, we see the rebellion gather strength, fueled by faith and the courage of those who dared to resist. The story of the Maccabees is far from over. With Mattathias's death, the responsibility for leading the rebellion fell to his sons. Among them, one man would rise to legendary status, a warrior whose courage, faith, and tactical brilliance would turn the tide against the Seleucid Empire. His name was Judas Maccabeus, and he would come to be known as the Hammer. Judas wasn't just a fighter, he was a symbol of hope in a time when all seemed lost. His leadership, marked by strategic genius and unwavering trust in God, transformed a desperate resistance into a powerful force that defied one of the greatest empires of the ancient world. After his father's death, Judas took command of the growing band of rebels. They were outnumbered, out-equipped, and relentlessly pursued by the Seleucid army. But what they lacked in resources, they made up for in faith and determination. Judas inspired his men by reminding them of the victories God had given their ancestors. "Do not be afraid of their numbers or their strength," he said. "The Lord will fight for us, as he did for our fathers." Judas' first task was to rally the disheartened and organize them into a disciplined fighting force. He understood that the key to victory wasn't just courage, it was strategy. Under his leadership, the Maccabees began launching guerrilla attacks, striking swiftly and retreating into the wilderness before the Seleucid forces could respond. These small victories boosted morale and sent a clear message. The Maccabees were not to be underestimated. But the true test of Judas's leadership came in two pivotal battles that would define the rebellion: the Battle of Emmaus and the Battle of Beth-zur. The Battle of Emmaus was a turning point in the revolt. The Seleucid army, led by General Gorgias, had been sent to crush the rebellion once and for all. Confident in their superior numbers and weaponry, the Seleucids established a camp near Emmaus, preparing to hunt down the Maccabees. Judas, however, had a different plan. Knowing that a direct confrontation would be suicide, he devised a bold strategy. He divided his forces, leaving a small contingent behind to create the illusion of a defensive position. Meanwhile, he led the majority of his men on a nighttime march around the enemy camp. As dawn broke, the Seleucid army launched an attack on the decoy position, only to find it abandoned. Before they could regroup, Judas and his men struck from the rear, catching them completely off guard. Chaos erupted in the camp as the Maccabees pressed their advantage, routing the Seleucid forces and seizing their supplies. The victory at Emmaus was nothing short of miraculous. It demonstrated not only Judas' tactical brilliance, but also the Maccabees' resilience and faith. News of the victory spread, inspiring others to join the rebellion and strengthening the resolve of those already fighting. But Judas knew that the war was far from over. The Seleucids would return, and the Maccabees needed to be ready. His next major test came at the Battle of Beth-zur, where the stakes were even higher. Beth-zur, a strategic fortress on the southern border of Judea, was under threat from a massive Seleucid force led by Lysias, one of Antiochus IV's most trusted generals. If Beth-zur fell, it would open the way for the Seleucids to march on Jerusalem and crush the rebellion at its heart. Judas rallied his men, reminding them of God's faithfulness. "It is not by the strength of our arms that we will win," he told them, "but by the strength of our faith." With these words, he led his army to intercept the Seleucids before they could reach the fortress. The Battle of Beth-zur was fierce, with both sides fighting desperately for control. The Seleucids, confident in their numerical superiority, pressed forward with relentless force. But Judas had prepared his men well. Using the rugged terrain to their advantage, the Maccabees launched a series of coordinated strikes, cutting off enemy supply lines and exploiting the Seleucids' overconfidence. As the battle raged, the tide began to turn. The Maccabees, driven by their faith and the leadership of Judas, broke through the Seleucid ranks, forcing them to retreat. The victory at Beth-zur was another critical moment in the rebellion, solidifying Judas's reputation as a leader chosen by God. These battles were not just military victories, they were spiritual triumphs. For the Jewish people, each victory was a reminder that their God had not abandoned them, even in the darkest of times. Judas's leadership wasn't just about strategy, it was about faith. He constantly pointed his men back to God, reminding them that the true battle belonged to the Lord. Imagine standing on the battlefield at Emmaus, watching as Judas's plan unfolded. You see the confusion in the enemy ranks, the courage of the Maccabees as they charge into the fray, and the triumphant shouts as the Seleucids flee. The sense of victory is overwhelming, not just because of the battle won, but because it feels like a vindication of faith itself. Now picture yourself at Beth-zur, facing a seemingly invincible enemy. The odds are against you, but as Judas lifts his voice in prayer, you feel a surge of courage. When the dust settles and the Seleucids retreat, you know that what you've witnessed is more than strategy. It's the hand of God at work. Judas' courage challenges us to reflect on our own battles. What are the struggles in our lives that require boldness and faith? How can we, like Judas, trust in God's strength even when the odds seem insurmountable? His story also reminds us that leadership is not about power, it's about service. Judas didn't fight for his own glory. He fought to preserve the covenant and to restore the worship of God. His victories were not just military achievements, but acts of devotion. As we move from the rise of Judas Maccabeus to the rededication of the temple, we see how his leadership paved the way for one of the most profound moments in Jewish history. The story of the Maccabees is far from over, and its lessons continue to inspire us to fight for what matters most. From the resounding victories at Emmaus and Beth-zur, Judas Maccabeus and his followers pressed forward, driven not only by the desire to secure their land, but by a burning need to restore the heart of their faith. The temple in Jerusalem, desecrated by Antiochus IV Epiphanes, stood as both a symbol of their oppression and a beacon of their hope. Reclaiming and rededicating it would not only be a military triumph, but a spiritual renewal, a declaration that the God of Israel had not abandoned his people. The road to Jerusalem was not without challenges. The Seleucid forces, though repeatedly defeated, remained a looming threat, their numbers vast and their resources seemingly endless. But Judas Maccabeus and his army, emboldened by their faith and their victories, marched with a singular purpose: to cleanse the temple and restore the worship of the one true God. As the Maccabees approached Jerusalem, the city bore the scars of Antiochus's tyranny. The temple, once the dwelling place of God's presence, was now a desecrated ruin. Pagan idols filled its courts, and the altar had been polluted with unholy sacrifices. The sight was a stark reminder of the oppression they had endured, but it also fueled their resolve. Judas and his men entered the temple, their hearts heavy with sorrow and determination. The defilement was everywhere: broken altars, scattered debris, and the stench of idolatry lingering in the air. But Judas was undeterred. "Remove every trace of impurity," he commanded. "We will make this place holy again." The cleansing began with a fervor born of both anger and devotion. Pagan idols were smashed, and the remnants of sacrilege were hauled away. The altar, defiled beyond repair, was dismantled stone by stone and replaced with a new one, built according to the laws of the Torah. The golden lampstand, the table for the bread of the presence, and the incense altar were restored with reverence, each piece a step toward reclaiming their covenant with God. As the work progressed, a sense of anticipation filled the air. The people knew this moment was more than a restoration of the temple. It was a renewal of their faith, a testament to God's enduring presence even in the darkest times. The day of rededication arrived, and the temple courts were filled with the sound of psalms and shouts of joy. Priests, dressed in sacred garments, lit the lamps of the golden menorah, a symbol of God's light and guidance. But as they prepared to consecrate the temple, a problem arose. Only a small amount of consecrated oil could be found, just enough to keep the menorah burning for one day. The process of making new oil, pure and holy, would take 8 days. Faced with this shortage, the people could have despaired, but instead they lit the menorah, trusting that God, who had delivered them in battle, would provide. What happened next became the stuff of miracles. The small amount of oil burned not for 1 day, but for 8, illuminating the temple until new oil could be prepared. This divine provision was a sign that God's favor was upon them, a reminder that his power was not limited by human constraints. The rededication of the temple marked a turning point in Jewish history. It wasn't just a military victory, it was a spiritual triumph. The people had reclaimed their faith, their identity, and their connection to the God of their ancestors. To commemorate this miraculous event, the festival of Hanukkah was established, a celebration of dedication, light, and divine intervention. Every year, Jewish families would light the menorah, remembering not only the oil that burned for 8 days, but the courage and faith of those who fought to restore the temple. Imagine standing in the temple courts on that day, surrounded by the sights and sounds of the rededication. The menorah's golden light flickers against the walls, and the air is filled with the scent of incense and the sound of prayers. You feel the weight of history and the joy of redemption, knowing that this moment is the culmination of countless sacrifices and unyielding faith. Now consider the deeper meaning of the oil that burned beyond its capacity. It wasn't just a miracle of provision. It was a symbol of God's enduring presence. In a time when his people felt abandoned, he showed them that his light could never be extinguished. The story of the rededication challenges us to reflect on our own lives. What are the temples of our hearts that need cleansing and renewal? How can we, like the Maccabees, reclaim what has been defiled by the world and dedicate it to God? It also reminds us that even in moments of scarcity, God provides. The miracle of the oil wasn't about abundance. It was about trust. It was about believing that God's power is sufficient, even when our resources are not. As we move from the rededication of the temple to the continuing struggles of the Maccabees, the story of First Maccabees invites us to see the hand of God in both the miraculous and the mundane. The light of the menorah, burning against all odds, serves as a reminder that his faithfulness endures forever. How does this story inspire you to seek renewal in your own life? What areas of your faith need to be rededicated to God, trusting in his provision and guidance? Let the rededication of the temple and the miracle of the oil remind us that no matter how dark the world becomes, the light of God's presence shines brighter still. The glow of the newly rededicated temple was a triumph for the Jewish people, a symbol of restored faith and victory over oppression. But the rededication was not the end of the fight. It was only the beginning. The Seleucid Empire, though shaken, was far from defeated, and Judas Maccabeus knew that securing independence would require even greater sacrifices. The rebellion continued, marked by both heroic victories and devastating losses, as the Maccabees fought to ensure that their people could live and worship freely. Fresh from the rededication of the temple, Judas turned his attention to consolidating Jewish autonomy. The Seleucid forces, humiliated by their defeats at Emmaus and Beth Zur, regrouped and launched renewed efforts to crush the rebellion. But Judas, now a seasoned leader and strategist, met them with unyielding resolve. The battles that followed were fierce, each one a testament to Judas's leadership and the unwavering faith of his army. The Maccabees often found themselves outnumbered and outmatched, yet their victories were fueled by a belief that God was on their side. Judas constantly reminded his men of the miracles they had already witnessed. "It is not the size of the army that wins the battle," he declared, "but the strength that comes from heaven." One of the most significant campaigns during this period was the defense of the Jewish people in surrounding regions. Communities outside Judea faced relentless persecution, and Judas sent forces to protect them, extending the reach of the rebellion. His efforts united scattered Jewish populations, strengthening their resolve and their identity as a covenant people. But the Seleucids were relentless, determined to regain control of Judea. They amassed an enormous army under the command of General Bacchides. Judas and his forces, though courageous, were vastly outnumbered. The final confrontation came at the Battle of Elasa, where Judas led his men in a desperate fight against overwhelming odds. The battlefield was chaos. Shouts and cries mingled with the clash of swords as the Maccabees fought with everything they had. Judas, as always, was at the forefront, rallying his men and striking fear into the enemy ranks. But the sheer size of the Seleucid army was too great to overcome. Judas fell in battle that day, his death a devastating blow to the rebellion. The men who survived carried his body from the field, mourning not just the loss of their leader, but the loss of a symbol, a man whose faith and courage had inspired a nation. The death of Judas Maccabeus could have marked the end of the rebellion. The Seleucids believed that without their leader, the Jewish resistance would crumble. But they underestimated the resolve of the Maccabees and the legacy Judas had left behind. Leadership passed to his brothers, Jonathan and Simon, who took up the mantle with determination. Jonathan, the younger of the two, became the new commander, leading the resistance with skill and diplomacy. He navigated the shifting alliances and political intrigues of the Seleucid court, using both military strength and strategic negotiations to keep the rebellion alive. Simon, known for his wisdom and administrative abilities, later succeeded Jonathan. Under his leadership, the Maccabees achieved what had once seemed impossible, the establishment of Jewish autonomy. Simon's efforts culminated in the formation of the Hasmonean dynasty. A ruling line descended from Mattathias and his sons. The Hasmonean dynasty marked a significant turning point in Jewish history. For the first time in centuries, the Jewish people were governed by their own leaders, free from foreign rule. The dynasty ruled Judea for nearly a century, overseeing a period of cultural and religious revival. The temple, cleansed and rededicated, became a center of worship and national identity once again. But the legacy of the Maccabees was not without its complications. As the Hasmonean dynasty grew in power, it faced internal divisions and external pressures, leading to conflicts that would eventually invite Roman intervention. By the time of the New Testament, the political landscape of Judea had shifted dramatically, but the spirit of the Maccabees lived on in the collective memory of the Jewish people. Imagine standing on the battlefield at Elasa, watching as Judas Maccabeus leads one final charge. His voice carries above the din of battle, rallying his men with words of faith and courage. The sight of him fighting alongside his soldiers, unyielding even in the face of death, leaves an indelible mark on those who survive. Now picture yourself years later, during the reign of Simon, as the people of Judea celebrate their newfound autonomy. The streets of Jerusalem are filled with the sound of music and prayer, the temple restored to its former glory. The sacrifices of the Maccabees are not forgotten. They are woven into the fabric of the nation's identity. The continuing struggle for independence challenges us to consider the cost of freedom. The Maccabees fought not for personal gain, but for the right to worship God and live according to His law. Their story reminds us that faith and perseverance can achieve what seems impossible, even in the face of overwhelming odds. It also invites us to reflect on the legacy we leave behind. Judas Maccabeus did not live to see the full fruits of his labor, but his courage and faith inspired others to carry on the fight. How can we, in our own lives, leave a legacy of faith and determination for those who come after us? As we move from the battles of Judas to the establishment of the Hasmonean dynasty, we see how the Maccabees' sacrifices paved the way for a new chapter in Jewish history. Their story is a testament to the power of faith, the strength of community, and the enduring hope that sustains God's people in every generation. What battles in your life require the courage and perseverance of the Maccabees? How can their example inspire you to fight for what matters most, trusting that even in the darkest moments, God is at work? The story of First Maccabees continues to challenge and inspire us, reminding us that the fight for faith and freedom is never in vain. From the victories of Judas Maccabeus and the rise of the Hasmonean dynasty, we now turn to the deeper and more sobering side of the Maccabean struggle, the cost of resistance. For every battle won, there was a price paid, and for many, that price was their very lives. This is the part of the story that challenges us to examine the strength of our own faith. It is a story of martyrdom, suffering, and unshakable belief in the face of unspeakable cruelty. At the heart of this resistance was a willingness to endure suffering rather than abandon God. The courage of the Maccabees and those who followed them was not born of sheer defiance. It was born of faith, a conviction that their lives belonged to God and that no earthly power could take that from them. One of the most harrowing accounts of martyrdom during this period comes not from First Maccabees itself, but from Second Maccabees, which complements and deepens the narrative of the rebellion. It tells the story of a mother and her 7 sons who were arrested and brought before Antiochus IV Epiphanes for refusing to eat pork, a direct violation of God's law. Their defiance infuriated the king, who demanded their compliance. One by one, the brothers were tortured and killed in front of their mother, each given the chance to save their lives by abandoning their faith. Yet, not one of them faltered. The eldest brother spoke first. "We are ready to die rather than transgress the laws of our ancestors." His resolve set the tone for what followed, a testament to the power of faith in the face of death. As each brother faced the king, they expressed not fear, but defiance, declaring their trust in God and their hope in the resurrection. One said, "The King of the universe will raise us up to live again, because we have died for his laws." The youngest son was brought last, and the king, desperate to break the family's resolve, promised him riches and power if he would renounce his faith. But the boy, encouraged by his mother, refused. She said to him, "Do not fear this butcher. Prove yourself worthy of your brothers and accept death, so that in God's mercy I may receive you back again with them." Her words were not those of despair, but of unshakable faith. She believed that the sacrifice her family was making would not end in defeat, but in eternal victory. This story, though deeply painful, is not unique. Throughout the rebellion, countless men and women chose martyrdom over apostasy, enduring torture, imprisonment, and death, rather than bow to pagan gods or abandon the covenant. Their faith fueled the rebellion, inspiring others to take up arms and reminding them that the fight was not just for land or freedom, but for the very soul of their people. Faith was the thread that held the rebellion together. Judas Maccabeus and his followers believed that their victories on the battlefield were not merely the result of strategy, but the result of God's intervention. Time and again, they attributed their success to his power, not their own. Before every battle, Judas prayed with his men, calling on God to fight for them as he had fought for their ancestors. But faith was not only for the battlefield, it was for the moments of quiet suffering, the times when hope seemed distant and the cost of resistance felt overwhelming. It was faith that sustained the mother and her sons as they faced Antiochus, It was faith that gave the Maccabees the courage to continue fighting even after Judas's death. And it was faith that inspired the Jewish people to persevere through years of oppression and struggle. This kind of faith doesn't come easily. It is forged in the fire of trial and tested in the crucible of sacrifice. The Maccabees' story challenges us to ask, what are we willing to sacrifice to remain faithful to God in our own lives? Imagine being one of the brothers standing before Antiochus, knowing that compliance would save your life, but would also mean betraying everything you believe. Imagine the strength it would take to look death in the eye and declare, "I will not abandon my God." Now imagine being the mother, watching each of your sons endure unspeakable pain, knowing that you will soon share their fate. Yet in the midst of your grief, you find the strength to encourage them to remain faithful, believing that their sacrifice is not in vain. This is the kind of faith that transcends circumstances, the kind that sees beyond the immediate pain to the eternal promise. It is a faith that declares, as one of the brothers did, "It is better to die at the hands of men and rely on God's promise to be raised again." The story of the Maccabees reminds us that faith is not just about what we believe, it's about what we're willing to do because of that belief. For the Maccabees and those who followed them, faith was worth everything, their comfort, their safety, even their lives. It also reminds us that faith is not always about victory in this life. Many of the Maccabees' greatest heroes did not live to see the fruits of their sacrifices. Yet their faith was not in vain. Their courage inspired a movement, their sacrifices strengthened their people, and their hope pointed to a future beyond the immediate struggles of their time. As we reflect on their story, we are challenged to consider the cost of our own faith. In a world where compromise often feels easier than conviction, the Maccabees call us to stand firm. Their story asks us, what are we willing to sacrifice to remain faithful to God? The cost of resistance is high, but the reward is greater. The faith that sustained the Maccabees is the same faith that sustains us today, a faith in a God who is faithful, a God who delivers, and a God who promises that no sacrifice made for him is ever in vain. As we move forward, the story of First Maccabees continues to remind us of the power of faith and the cost of standing firm. The lessons of the Maccabees challenge us not only to admire their courage, but to embody it in our own lives. How does their story inspire you to live boldly for your faith? And what sacrifices are you willing to make to remain faithful to God? Let the story of the Maccabees remind us that though the cost of resistance is great, the reward of faith is eternal. From the harrowing stories of martyrdom and unshakable faith, the story of First Maccabees invites us to step back and view it within the larger biblical narrative. The struggles, triumphs, and sacrifices of the Maccabees are not isolated from the broader story of Scripture. Instead, they echo themes that resound throughout the Old and New Testaments, weaving their story into the fabric of God's redemptive plan. The parallels between First Maccabees and the heroes of Scripture, Moses, Joshua, and David, are striking, each figure representing a facet of the Maccabean legacy. Beyond these connections, the Maccabean revolt plays a pivotal role in shaping the world into which Jesus would be born, providing a vital bridge between the Old and New Testaments. At its core, First Maccabees is a story of deliverance, one that recalls the mighty acts of God in rescuing his people throughout history. Just as Moses led the Israelites out of Egypt, guiding them through the wilderness and establishing the covenant at Sinai, so too did Judas Maccabeus lead his people out of spiritual and political oppression. Like Moses, Judas was not just a military leader. He was a man of deep faith, constantly pointing his followers back to God as the source of their strength. When facing overwhelming odds, Judas would pray as Moses once did, calling on God to fight for his people. Their victories, though achieved through courage and strategy, were attributed to divine intervention, just as the parting of the Red Sea or the defeat of Amalek had been in the days of the Exodus. The parallels to Joshua are equally compelling. Like Joshua, who led the Israelites into the Promised Land, Judas Maccabeus fought to reclaim and defend the land that God had given to his people. The battles waged by Judas bear a striking resemblance to the conquest of Canaan, with each victory seen as a fulfillment of God's promises. Consider the cleansing of the temple following the Maccabees' victories. This act of rededication mirrors Joshua's command to sanctify the land and establish it as a holy space devoted to the Lord. Both leaders understood that the fight was not merely political or territorial, it was spiritual. Their battles were fought not just with swords, but with faith, seeking to uphold the covenant and honor the God who had called them. And then there is the figure of David, whose life of courage, faith, and reliance on God serves as a model for the Maccabees. Judas Maccabeus, like David, was an unlikely hero who rose to greatness through his trust in God. Just as David stood against Goliath, defying the might of the Philistines with only a sling and his faith, Judas stood against the Seleucid Empire, a small band of rebels challenging one of the most powerful armies of the ancient world. The victories of Judas, like those of David, were seen as evidence of God's favor. Both men were not just warriors, but worshippers, men who sought to glorify God through their actions. The rededication of the temple under Judas' leadership echoes David's desire to build a house for the Lord, a place where his presence could dwell among his people. Beyond these individual parallels, the Maccabean revolt plays a crucial role in shaping the world of the New Testament. The struggles of the Maccabees preserved Jewish identity and traditions during a time when assimilation threatened to erase them. Their resistance ensured that the laws, customs, and worship practices of the Jewish people would survive, laying the foundation for the faith into which Jesus was born. The celebration of Hanukkah, established to commemorate the rededication of the temple, provides a glimpse into the cultural and religious landscape of Jesus' time. In John 10:22-23, we read that Jesus himself was present in Jerusalem during the Feast of Dedication, teaching in the temple courts. This connection highlights how the events of First Maccabees continued to shape Jewish life and faith even centuries later. The themes of First Maccabees, faith under fire, the cost of resistance, and the hope of deliverance resonate deeply with the New Testament. The story of the Maccabees foreshadows the ultimate deliverance brought by Jesus Christ, whose life and death fulfilled the promises of the covenant. Just as the Maccabees fought to reclaim the temple and restore true worship, Jesus came to cleanse the hearts of his people, establishing a new covenant through his sacrifice. The rededication of the temple points forward to the greater work of redemption accomplished on the cross, where Jesus became the ultimate high priest, offering himself as the perfect sacrifice. The historical accuracy of First Maccabees adds another layer of significance to its narrative. Unlike some other texts from the intertestamental period, First Maccabees reads more like a historical account, providing detailed records of battles, treaties, and political events. Its depiction of the Seleucid Empire, the geography of Judea, and the cultural tensions of the time aligns with what we know from other historical sources. This accuracy makes First Maccabees a valuable resource for understanding the Jewish traditions and context that shaped the New Testament world. It offers insights into the challenges faced by the Jewish people during the intertestamental period and their unwavering commitment to God's covenant. Imagine reading First Maccabees as a member of the early church, reflecting on the courage and faith of those who came before you. You see in their story the same themes of perseverance and hope that define your own struggles as a follower of Christ. The Maccabees' resistance to oppression inspires you to stand firm in your faith, even in the face of persecution. Now consider how their story connects to our lives today. Just as the Maccabees fought to preserve their identity and worship, we are called to live as witnesses to God's truth in a world that often challenges our beliefs. Their faith reminds us that the battles we face are not just physical or cultural, but deeply spiritual. The story of First Maccabees challenges us to see the broader picture of God's work in history. It reminds us that the struggles of the past are not isolated. They are part of the ongoing story of God's people, a story that finds its fulfillment in Christ and continues in us. How does this connection to the biblical narrative inspire you? What parallels do you see between the faith of the Maccabees and the faith we are called to live out today? Let the story of First Maccabees deepen your understanding of Scripture and strengthen your resolve to stand firm in faith, knowing that you are part of a story that spans generations and points to the eternal hope we have in Christ. From its profound connections to the broader biblical narrative, First Maccabees leaves us with lessons that resonate far beyond its historical context. The story of the Maccabees is not just about battles fought long ago. It's about courage, faith, and the cost of standing firm in a world that often challenges belief. For modern readers, this story offers profound insights into what it means to live boldly for God, no matter the cost. The first, and perhaps most striking lesson of First Maccabees is the importance of courage in the face of overwhelming odds. The Maccabees didn't have the numbers, weapons, or political power to match the might of the Seleucid Empire. What they did have was an unshakable conviction that their faith was worth defending, even at the cost of their lives. Judas Maccabeus and his followers teach us that courage isn't the absence of fear, it's the determination to act despite it. They stood firm, not because they knew they would win every battle, but because they believed that their cause was righteous and that God was with them. This kind of courage is just as relevant today. In a world where faith is often ridiculed and standing for biblical principles can invite opposition, the example of the Maccabees challenges us to ask, are we willing to take a stand for what we believe? Do we have the courage to remain faithful even when it costs us our reputation, relationships, or comfort? Another powerful theme in First Maccabees is perseverance. The Maccabean revolt wasn't a single battle or a short-lived rebellion. It was a long and grueling struggle that spanned years. Judas and his brothers faced not only external enemies, but also internal challenges, including betrayal, division, and the weariness that comes with prolonged conflict. Yet through it all, they persevered. Their determination was rooted in their faith, a belief that God had called them to this fight and that He would sustain them. This perseverance reminds us that faith is not a sprint, it's a marathon. There will be seasons of struggle, moments when giving up feels easier than pressing on. But the story of the Maccabees encourages us to keep going, trusting that God's strength is made perfect in our weakness. Perhaps one of the most convicting lessons of First Maccabees is the cost of religious freedom. For the Maccabees, this cost was painfully tangible. Lives were lost, families torn apart, and communities uprooted. They fought not for political gain, but for the right to worship God and live according to His law. Their sacrifices challenge us to reflect on the freedoms we often take for granted and to consider what we are willing to sacrifice for our faith. In today's world, the fight for religious freedom continues. Believers around the globe face persecution, imprisonment, and even death for their faith. The story of the Maccabees calls us to solidarity with these modern-day heroes, to pray for them, support them, and draw inspiration from their courage. The unwavering faith of the Maccabees is perhaps their greatest legacy. Their trust in God was the foundation of their courage, perseverance, and sacrifice. They believed that their fight was not just for their generation, but for the generations to come, a belief that motivated them to endure unimaginable hardships. For modern believers, this faith is both a challenge and an encouragement. It reminds us that our struggles, though different, are part of the same story. A story of a God who is faithful and a people who are called to be faithful in return. The Maccabees inspire us to live with eternity in mind, to focus not on temporary victories or losses, but on the eternal reward that comes from following God wholeheartedly. Imagine standing among the Maccabees, surrounded by people who have lost so much, yet refuse to give up. You see their faces, weary but resolute, their voices lifted in prayer before each battle. You feel the weight of their sacrifices and the power of their faith, and you can't help but wonder, what would I do in their place? Now imagine bringing that same resolve into your own life. What are the battles you face? What are the sacrifices you're called to make? The courage and faith of the Maccabees remind us that even when the cost is great, the reward is greater. So, what does 1 Maccabees teach us about living boldly for our faith in a world that challenges it? First, it teaches us that courage begins with conviction. The Maccabees didn't fight because it was easy or popular. They fought because they believed in the truth of God's word. Their example challenges us to examine our own convictions and to ask, what do I believe, and am I willing to stand for it? Second, it reminds us that perseverance is key. Faith is not a one-time decision, but a daily commitment to follow God, even when the road is hard. The Maccabees story encourages us to stay the course, trusting that God is with us in every struggle. Finally, it calls us to value our faith more than anything else. The Maccabees were willing to give up everything, comfort, safety, even their lives, to remain faithful to God. Their sacrifices inspire us to hold our faith with the same reverence, remembering that it is not just a belief, but a relationship with the God who loves us and calls us his own. As we reflect on the lessons of 1 Maccabees, let's ask ourselves, how does this story inspire us to live boldly for our faith? What steps can we take to stand firm in our convictions, persevere through challenges, and value our relationship with God above all else? The Maccabees' courage, perseverance, and faith are a powerful reminder that God's people are called to be a light in the darkness, a beacon of hope in a world that often opposes the truth. Let their story inspire you to live with boldness, trusting that the God who sustained them is the same God who walks with you today. From the defiance of Mattathias to the rededication of the temple, from Judas Maccabeus' heroic victories to the enduring lessons of faith and sacrifice, the story of 1 Maccabees is one that echoes across the centuries. It is a story of courage in the face of oppression, perseverance through unimaginable trials, and the unyielding fight to remain faithful to God in a world determined to erase his name. But 1 Maccabees is more than just a historical account. It is a testament to the resilience of faith and the cost of living for something greater than ourselves. In its pages, we see the power of a community united by belief, the importance of standing firm in our convictions, and the profound truth that God's light can never be extinguished, even in the darkest times. As modern believers, 1 Maccabees challenges us to examine our own lives. How do we respond when our faith is tested? Are we willing to sacrifice comfort, security, or even our lives to remain true to God? The Maccabees story is not just about their time, it is about ours as well. It reminds us that the fight for faith is ongoing, that every generation is called to stand firm against the forces that seek to silence the truth. This is why First Maccabees matters. It bridges the gap between the Old and New Testaments, showing us how God's people preserved their identity and worship in the face of overwhelming odds. It provides historical context for the world into which Jesus was born, a world shaped by the sacrifices of the Maccabees and their unwavering commitment to the covenant. And it inspires us today. The courage of the Maccabees, the faith of the martyrs, and the hope that sustained them through every trial are the same qualities we are called to embody in our own lives. Their story encourages us to stand boldly for our beliefs, to persevere through challenges, and to trust that God is always with us, no matter the cost. At Deep Bible Stories, our mission is to uncover the hidden gems of Scripture, including the banned books that have so much to teach us about God's work through His people. If this video inspired you to dive deeper into the Bible and its stories of faith and courage, share it with someone who needs to hear this powerful message. What part of First Maccabees resonated most with you? Was it Mattathias' defiance, Judas's heroic leadership, or the unwavering faith of those who chose death over apostasy? Let us know in the comments and tell us which banned book you'd like us to explore next. The story of First Maccabees is one of perseverance, hope, and triumph. It reminds us that no matter how great the challenges we face, the God who sustained His people then is the same God who sustains us now. May its lessons inspire you to live boldly for your faith, trusting in the God who never abandons His people.